introduce Bert, and then my very smart colleague Ruth Langer will take over as the sort of interlocutor and convener of this. We're honored and delighted to have Bert Howe with us today, who is the Executive Director of Intersections. I want Bert just to say a few things about that. Intersections does all kinds of stuff. You have the Civitas faculty lunches and the Compagnia pilgrimage and the Forefront social program. So why am I channeling you, Bert? Why don't you just say what you do? So it's like.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today. So yes, Intersections does a number of things for professors and administrators on campus to introduce the overall mission and deepen the mission for people who teach and mentor and research here. So we do things on campus like lunches and conversations. We do things off campus. We do retreats in Maine. We do a writing retreat in Maine for a week every summer, and we hope to do that again this year. We take faculty to Central America and to Europe on pilgrimages and immersion trips. So
I must say, Bert, that writing retreat I was on in Maine is one of my best Boston College experiences. I mean, I made friends there that I'm still good friends with. So it's like,
I'm glad to hear that. No, we're very hopeful that Maine will happen again, that the Villa retreat will happen again this summer, and it's looking positive. But I'm also just really grateful to be here today to talk about first generation students and a group of students that very much includes first generation, but it's slightly different, the Montserrat students. And so you may know a lot about those differences, but just to start off a few of my remarks, I'll say that Montserrat is a program on campus through Mission and Ministry. So I know it quite well, based on the fact that I knew the student who started it. I worked with Jack Butler to create the Montserrat, to add to the already excellent resources that Boston College has for first gen and low income students. But what Montserrat does is takes a list from financial aid. And so to be a Montserrat student, you have to be determined by the university to be low income and high financial need. The best, the most sure way to become a Montserrat student or to be designated as such by the university is to be eligible for a Pell Grant. Now, Pell Grants are if a family income is between $50,000, but usually closer to $20,000 per year, any student in the country is eligible for a $6,000 grant called Pell. And so that's a kind of way that we can track low incomeness across universities in the United States. You don't have to be a Pell Grant recipient, though, in order to be designated a Montserrat student, a low income student, because of the nature of inequality and the nature of income. It's sort of compared with other students at Boston College. We have a very affluent student body. And so there are a number of students who do not have Pell Grants, but are also designated Montserrat. At Boston College, right now, there are approximately 2,000 Montserrat students. First gen students, as you know, also has a definition that can range, but generally it means that your parents did not go to college. And there are roughly, according to Rosanna, who I talked to last week, around 1,000 first gen students at BC. Maybe a little bit more depending on the year, maybe a little bit less, but generally between 1,000 and 1,100 or 1,200 students. So you can see that there's a natural overlap that many first gen students are also low income, but it's not automatic. Some first gen students have parents that make high incomes, and so they wouldn't be considered Montserrat. Some Montserrat students have low income, but their parents went to college. So the groups are overlapped, but different. And we have good news at BC around low income and first generation students, in that when we look at the rate of graduation, specifically for Pell Grant students, which again contains many first gen, we are in the top 5 graduation rates for Pell students. We graduate 95% of Pell Grants students at Boston College, and have for the last several years, which puts us in the top 5. The average across private higher education is 54%. So we're doing extraordinarily well I believe, with our graduation rates for Pell students. And I think there's two reasons for that. The first is resources. Boston College invests in its students, all of its students, but particularly HANA students, first-gen students, low-income students, get resources through colleagues that are on this call and offices such as Learning to Learn, the Bowman Center, Montserrat, et cetera. The second reason I would say that we're so good at graduating Pell students is our faculty. I mean, we have a faculty that is world-class in research, but also cares about the classroom and teaching and mentoring. And they care about all of our students, but I think the faculty who are most in tune with first-gen low-income students do an extraordinary job of supporting them towards that goal of graduation. There's also bad news, though. The bad news is that when we survey students who are Montserrat and or first gen, they often tell us that they feel that they don't belong at Boston College. And too many of them suffer in silence because of the kind of emotional reaction of being at a place that is so affluent. And this doesn't affect all those students, certainly not, but it hinders some in reaching their full potential academically and socially. And so I want to talk today about a couple of different principles out of sociology and history that help me try to understand what's happening with the way students often feel about their experience at Boston College if they are low income and first gen. The first I would cite comes from sociology, and it's this idea called the hidden injuries of class. And so this idea is that many low-income first-gen students desire upward mobility. That's one of the reasons they come to Boston College, not the only reason, but one. And so they want the gains that education can give them, but they also simultaneously realize, especially once they start going to a place like this, that they can also receive loss from education. In other words, they find separation from family, culture, friends, from home. And Boston College, like many American higher education institutions, I believe, has a kind of taboo around social class that is certainly very strong in our student culture. And so when students don't talk about something and they feel this kind of wrenching movement between a foot in one door, which is home, and by the way, they don't always feel like they completely fit in at home because they're getting a college education at Boston College, and they feel that they don't fit in completely at college because they're low income or first gen. Then there becomes often a sense of shame, and the shame can fester, and it becomes worse because it's not necessarily acknowledged by affluent peers. Affluent peers have a hard time understanding the problem because for them, they feel, well, if you're low income and you're at Boston College, you've received the golden ticket and you're going to get that upper mobility that you claim to want. And so how could this be a problem? How could this be harmful to you in any way? And so that not understanding becomes this idea of the hidden injury. So that's one concept. Another is social and cultural capital. So sociologists define this as the easy familiarity with knowledge necessary for navigating an institution. And we know from looking at the literature, the research, that affluent students get this kind of social and cultural capital almost from birth. It comes from rich uncles, grandmothers, rich friends of the family. They receive it at golf courses, at the Cape, at Nantucket, at tailgates, at fancy brunches. And what it usually means is that they're continually getting help to understand a complicated place like Boston College from people who have been there, from their parents, from other relatives. Maybe if it's not Boston College, it's places, elite institutions like Boston College. What they're learning, in other words, is a whole series of secret handshakes. And secret handshakes are never rocket science. once you know the handshake, it's not that complicated to repeat it. And what it's good for is opening doors. And what it's also good for is excluding those who don't know it. And so affluent students have this social and cultural capital, usually at higher levels than low-income first-gen students. And the other thing that happens is, they're good at knowing that you need to appear as if you're doing all of this on your own, that you're receiving no help whatsoever from any sort of outside resource, even though in reality, you've been getting help continually. And when you're on campus, you realize that there are resources around and you have a strong expectation that if you need help, you can ask for it, you will receive it. So on the low income side, and the first gen side, scholars tell us that it's very difficult for these students to ask for help. In fact, that's one of it's a marker in a way. And it's not obviously not true of all students, but it makes sense if you think about it. It depends a lot on where the student has gone to high school. So if they went to a prep school or a place that had high amount of resources, they might have a higher level of social and cultural capital. They may still be low income or first gen, that hasn't changed, but they have an understanding of how to navigate these sort of institutions. That gives them an advantage when they come. It's the students who are at high schools that are low resourced, public schools, for instance, in some rural and cities where there's no help to be found. And so the students get into a habit of not reaching out and asking for help because they know there's going to be no help given. And so they start to acquire a kind of no excuses mindset, which says asking for help is weak and it's cheating and maybe unethical. And so in their kind of real sense of personal dignity, they want to muscle through on their own, which creates a big problem at a place like Boston College, which almost expects students to access resources that are present. And if you don't, you end up, like some of our students, losing confidence and maybe even becoming paralyzed by doubt because the types of things that they were doing in high school that seemed to work are not working now in the university setting. And they have a real reluctance to access some of the great people on this call who could really give them some good advice, some good guidance, or some places to go. But when they refuse to do that, it's very hard to locate where the students are sometimes when they don't want to come in. One more concept, and then I'll tell you a little bit about a class that I teach. The third concept is from History of Higher Education, and it's called Outsiders. Some of the best historians of higher education, in my opinion, have looked at low-income first-gen students since the founding of Harvard in 1636. And what they found is that there have always been students who were poor, who needed help through scholarships to go to elite schools. Now, the percentage has always fluctuated. In some eras, it's very, very small. In others, it's expanded. But it's never been the case that there have been more low-income first-gen students than there are affluent students who have parents who've gone to college. It's always been a kind of small percentage or smaller percentage. And yet historians have also, as they've looked at these students, have recognized that they have flourished, or many have found ways to flourish despite the challenges at these schools. And that an unusually high percentage of them have gone on to be influential in the world as scholars, scientists, lawyers, doctors, leaders in government and other organizations. And so this gives me a lot of hope. And it also makes me think that graduation is a great goal. I mean, we know that if you graduate from college, your chances of success and happiness in the world are increased greatly. So the fact that Boston College graduates as many Pell students is a great indicator of success at Boston College. And I think we should be proud of that. And we should continue to work towards that. But I don't think it's enough. I don't think graduation in and of itself is a high enough standard. I think flourishing should be a standard for all of our students, and especially students who are disadvantaged by circumstances that they don't have any control over, like socioeconomic position in the world, the families that they grow up in. And I think one way to increase flourishing would be to increase the amount of Montserrat and first generation students on campus. Now, I recognize that this is controversial and expensive because it really means you need more financial aid. And you also need increased support. You need to get more staff and more resources at Learning to Learn at Bowman Center, at Montserrat, to support more students. But I think one of the reasons that it's harder to flourish at BC is the kind of invisibility that students experience based on how many are in the community. And you can change culture if you have a bigger group and become more visible. We are not the worst. Boston College is not the bottom of the list of the percentage of low-income students in elite schools. We're not even near the bottom. We're right in the middle of the pack, but we're not also at the top schools. It wouldn't take, it's not like asking for 30% more or 40% or something like that. If we had 10% more, that would make a very strong difference in the culture of campus. And I think we should mobilize alumni to try to contribute to a goal like this. But that's all very much beyond my pay grade. I do want to just say one thing before I open it up is I teach a course, a seminar on inequality through the Cross Currents program. Cross Currents is a 1-credit discussion seminar class run between the Provost's office and Student Affairs, and involves mission ministry staff as well. And the reason that I started this course on inequality was that I was a low-income student in college. I was not first gen. My parents both went to college, but they were school teachers in rural Arizona, and rural Arizona always has ranked at the bottom of teacher pay. And we were in a rural area, so it made it even worse. So anyway, when I went to an affluent college, I was convinced that I was the only student who'd ever experienced this before. I was full of shame because I thought it was really something wrong with me as I got to meet other students who had much more experiences and resources and networks and social capital than I did. I tried to cover it up as much as I possibly could to pass as a student who had money. It didn't work. I never talked to my peers about it. I never talked to faculty about it. I didn't ask for help on a regular basis, and I suffered in silence because of that. And so at BC, I wanted to try to be a part of the great work that is done here for students who are low income by providing a course where we look at life as poor students at affluent campuses. I work directly with Montserrat to recruit the students for this class. Every student in the class is a Montserrat student. We read memoirs of students who've gone to Stanford and Yale and Princeton, Vassar, Boston College, St. Michael's, and we're low income and have written about it. And we ask questions like, why are these books so popular? Why do low income students love these books, but also affluent people seem to love them as well? What does it say about the systems of inequality? And the great thing, final thing I'll say, is that Cross Currents is a really interesting course because simultaneous to the 1-credit discussion section, the students are also taking 3-credit courses around inequality in economics, in history, in theology, in philosophy, other disciplines, and that we try to connect what they're learning in those 3-credit courses to their lives and to what's happening to them as low income and often first-gen students at BC. So it's been a real joy to be a part of that Cross Currents seminar faculty and to work with the students year after year. We have great guest speakers like Yvonne McBarnett who come every year and talk to our to the students in the course. And I guess I'll end there and see where the conversation should go from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Bert. And I open the floor now to questions, follow-ups, additional thoughts.
I want to follow up the question addressed to Andy and Yvonne, who did a great job That was superb, Bert. Thank you. But Andy and Yvonne spoke last time. Is there, how successful, Bert, would you say BC is in getting rid of the shame part? It was very touching to hear you. They talked about this as well, but I mean, by the time people graduate, is that gone, or is that, I mean, how do we address that?
In many cases, Mark, yes, I think we are successful in addressing that with students who are willing to take advantage of the resources on campus. In other words, if they interact with any of the offices that you've invited to be part of this conversation, and many, many students do, they get excellent mentors. They get groups of students that they can interact with and identify with. What happens is if a student joins even one kind of affinity group around some of these issues, they can often find the confidence and the understanding that they are not alone and that they can go forward. What's difficult is that there are enough students and not enough staff, because we have great offices and great resources, but the number of students, vis-a-vis the staff that we have, it's hard to reach everybody, and some students will decide, not to access those resources. So that, I think, is one of the problems, and that's why I think faculty are so important in this question, and because what you do in the classroom and how you work with students is critical, and it can't just be the offices, although the offices are vital and absolutely necessary, and do, I would say, extraordinary work. Heroic work, given the amount of students they work with, the ratio to staff. But the faculty are a great resource too. So it's very possible, but it doesn't always happen. Some people leave here on paper quite successful. They've graduated, they've checked all the boxes, but their relationship to the university is fraught and painful.
Can I jump in with a question? Oh, sorry, Ruth. Are you gonna?
No, go ahead. I was going.
Thank you so much for that. Just incredibly generative and so helpful. I have a lot to chew on from what you've said here today. One of the questions, I have many questions. One of the questions that I have around this, and I am doing the thing I find most annoying when people do in my programs, which is you come in to tell us a little bit about teaching and faculty, and I'm going to ask you an institutional question. But one of the things I'm curious about is, I'm really excited about this idea of advocating to have a much larger percentage of students on campus be first gen, be high financial need students. And that seems really useful, but part of the problem also seems to be the disparity that exists, right? So on some level, there also needs to be more middle class, like genuinely middle class students. And obviously that's a national and global trend and not just a BC one, but thinking about what it would mean to have an actually economically diverse and not just the two extreme ends of the spectrum. Because I'm also thinking that, and not to be too cynical here, right, but the university is incentivized to center the experiences of the most privileged students who will go on to be good alumni in terms of good donors, right? And you're saying that many of the students who come through this experience end up leaving with all of the right in the world, with a fraught experience from this institution. And so I'm curious, it's a long winding way, but I guess my question is, what do you see would be necessary for the institution to not just accept more students, right? I do think you're right that like culture shift can happen when we make those, if there is a community that is able to find a sense of belonging, to support one another, to be advocates, to have a louder voice on campus. But what would it take for the institution to really privilege the needs of those students in the ways that it designs itself, and not just have them continue to be present, right? Like demographics aren't fate, right? I guess is what I'm saying. And so what would also need to shift to make that shift in demographics actually impactful on folks' experience? And that is a long and convoluted question, but I'm spiraling around that theme, I guess.
I think it's an excellent question. And I think you're right. There really would have to be a shift in not just on an institutional level, but on a national level, because the way we finance education in the US does get us towards this end of very high wealth, and then the generous and helpful way of getting students who are low income into the system too. But it leaves the question: what about the middle, and how would you achieve that? I think you would have to rehaul how you see education in general and how you pay for it. So I had a friend who's a professor at Williams. She's Canadian, and her daughter is a first-year student this year. And it was actually a friend of a friend, but we were having a conversation this summer about the process of getting into colleges. So the daughter was set on going to UC Berkeley or the University of Toronto. And because her mother's a citizen of Canada, Toronto was a real, option. The price tag for Berkeley as an out-of-state student was $70,000 a year, similar to Boston College. The price tag for Toronto was $3,000 a semester. And they looked at the comparable rankings, or they looked at the faculty, they looked at the resources, they looked at, and they decided that actually the University of Toronto was probably had an edge given their daughter's interests than Berkeley. And she's now a freshman at the University of Toronto. And it's just an enormous, she said she never felt so Canadian. And so recognizing that the way that this system is set up allows for the kind of economic diversity you're talking about. But we don't have such a system in this country. It's much more individualistic. It's much more about family being able to pay, and the kind of hyper competition around education. And so that drives a lot of this, I think. And so I think it's possible to do it. Other countries are doing it. So it's not like it's completely out of the realm of, but you need a lot of support, obviously, for a lot of collective support for the future of our children. And right now we don't seem to have that. We have a lot of support for our children, but not necessarily all the others who could benefit from a place like Berkeley or Toronto or BC or whatever.
A question, Bert, that I wanted to follow up. You used the language of there being a taboo on discussion about economic background, and taboo, using the language of taboos is already suggesting that this is something probably that shouldn't be happening. So how does, other than obviously the demographic shift that you propose would do something towards this, how do we address the taboo? How do we get that it named even, and do things as faculty, as people involved in programming for the university, to put this on the table, to make it be a topic of conversation?
Right. That's an excellent question, Ruth. I think one thing that I've noticed is when you have a subject that people don't address often, they don't have a vocabulary around it sometimes, and they because they don't practice it or use it, it becomes harder to naturally bring up or have as a conversation. So even when I have Montserrat students in class, there's a kind of stuttering that happens around talking to each other about social class, because again, little practice, vocabulary is low. And so anything we can do to help students practice it, to try to make the environment comfortable enough for them to talk about, even if the environment is somewhat artificial, like the classroom. But it's a challenging thing because they're not used to doing it. They feel what Montserrat students tell me is when they do try to talk about it, it results in mutual embarrassment. Their embarrassment because it's sort of admitting like a weakness or a fault in it. And at BC, the culture seems to be, you always present strength. You always present like a perfectly composed facade. And then, but then they also say that it embarrasses the people who they're talking with, who especially if they're not low income. And so they avoid it. They go very quiet about it. And so I think one way that faculty could think about doing this, or that I've noticed in the past, is faculty who acknowledge the presence of low-income students at Boston College through even simple things like on their syllabus, writing the words, if you are a Montserrat student, please come to my office hours, or please email me, tends to for the students to sort of say, okay, at least the faculty member recognizes and knows this program or this idea. Same with the language around first gen, so that just acknowledging it will make the Montserrat student feel more comfortable, perhaps having a conversation in private and with an office hour, and then sort of going from there, being able to again practice having conversations, opening up about it. I think any support that we can give to affinity groups. I know I think there's a first gen club on campus that deserves funding and any kind of support that we can give, so that students, even amongst themselves, among first gen students, can get practice talking about it, so that when they are in other conversations, it's less paralyzing to do it. But students will go to great lengths to cover where they're from, what's happening. And it's possible because there's no way to tell who's Montserrat and who's not. There's no like signal that you can get from how they dress, where they're from, what race they are. Generally, it doesn't correlate, even though our racism in our country would tell you certain races should be low income. It usually, if you look at the list at BC, it doesn't match up. And so by using the terms and knowing the vocabulary, and then signaling that to students, and then being able to try to start multiple conversations, would help them, I think, feel more comfortable and feel less stigmatized by that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Bert. I wanted to chime in really quickly and just kind of, so again, my name is Andy Patigny. I'm over at the Theobald Intercultural Center. And so last time we met, I kind of went through kind of some of the services and resources and things like that we provide. And I think Bert's kind of presentation was excellent in terms of some of the psychological and emotional impact that kind of play out. Now, the part that I think, Bert, because we work with a lot of students of color, I feel as though the white students, as you mentioned, can hide it a little bit better, right? Because the assumption is it's mostly the students of color that might find in Montserrat. And so I think in terms of stigma, already students of color are getting that look like, oh, you must be high need, even though they may not be, right? So we kind of have that play out. A couple of ways I think it also plays out in terms of high need in this particular community. The financial challenges in terms of books. And I think we might have touched on this last time, but in terms of now students, so before even, when we've tried things like book drives, I know Montserrat has kind of a book program, and that's not enough. So last year we started doing different things. And now with the codes, so before I might have been able to pass you a book, and we might have been able to recycle that book and save costs. But now with codes and some econ classes and other things that might be anywhere from $50 to $100 to $200, that's becoming an increased challenge. Bert mentioned kind of the impact in the classroom. We have so many students that do not have books for class even a month after the class started. And so that's huge. And so I'm wondering, is there a way to have either PDFs or things online or something, because that is starting to become the biggest kind of disparity. In terms of hiding it, I think that's another thing that students do in a negative way, is because now they want to keep up. So, all right, I don't want to stand out. So now how can I look like everybody else? And so you see that even from people not familiar with BC. I think even our new VP mentioned it. I think if you first get, wow, everybody kind of dresses the same, right? With these really, really expensive brands and clothing. And so even if you may or may not be able to afford it, you might get that new sneaker or outfit rather than the book, because again, psychologically, that shame is somewhat decreased a little bit. Because of the cost, a lot of students have to work. And so now if you're sacrificing it, and BC is a rigorous institution. And so now if you need to work 10, 20, and I know students who are working 30 or more hours a week. So think about that for a second. You're working 30 hours a week, and then you're still supposed to be in the library and keep up and that sort of thing. I mean, these are, you know, real challenges. And so that could also impact their involvement on campus, and absolutely their level of academics, depending on the school. And so some of these students, because they're working, because of the economic situation back home, are also part of their family's economic situation. So it's not like, all right, when I go to college, I'm just going to focus on my academics and X, Y, and Z. No, mom and dad still need this, little brother, sister still needs that. And that's a big challenge that sometimes there's not really much you can do, but that's the reality of their situation. And so not only are they balancing working in academics, they're also balancing needing to work in terms of the situation going on at home. So again, their family responsibilities. I mentioned the rigor of BC again, and to Bert's earlier point about intersectionality and crossover. And so we work with students of color. Many of them are first generation as well. And so just navigating the college process is difficult. But so if you happen to underload a particular semester, and so you didn't do the requisite 15 credits, maybe you failed a course, or maybe you had to withdraw, and now all of a sudden you need to make up a course, and maybe you're not familiar with overloading, or that would just be too much. So now you would need to either take a class during the summer to stay caught up, and many students can't do that. And so I see a lot of students that maybe can't come back to BC. You know, Bert just mentioned the cost of, you know, Toronto, $3,000 a semester compared to, you know, whatever it is, like 20, who knows here, et cetera. So students could maybe take a summer class somewhere else, or continue on at another college and graduate, as opposed to like basically $3,000 a class during the summer at BC. And so if you got to take 2 classes, that's $6,000 that does not count as part of your academic year financial aid, right? So that's a huge obstacle, which is why our office does offer the summer tuition remission program, to try to make sure students can stay on track to graduate. We also have Sister Thea's Closet. I feel this is tied into the shame and embarrassment potentially. And so if students don't have enough money to get toiletries, et cetera, they can anonymously complete a form and then come here to the center and pick it up. And even then, I'm not sure all students do it, because they probably feel as though, oh, you know, people are going to know why I'm there and things like that. I mean, that's a real thing. So we're constantly trying to promote Sister Thea's Closet and things like that. Our laptop loan program, the books, et cetera. So we're constantly trying to promote those, so that students don't feel like they're losing time or starting from behind. And so I think Bert's point about just kind of increased support, more staff, and probably just more transparency in terms of, you know, what students need to do to be successful, and the opportunities that might just be available for some students and not others. You know, and then you get into the social aspect of students trying to fit in. So when they're students are going out to dinner, or having these particular themes at parties that require you got to buy this and buy that, then that kind of puts students on the outside looking in as well. So those are just, I think, some of the ways that contribute to, say, the imposter syndrome, to not fitting in addition to just being, you know, similar to what I think as it relates to diversity and, say, students of color at BC, probably similar in terms of like a larger saturation of high need students, probably a larger saturation of students of color. I mean, 34% roughly are the percentage of students of color at BC. Asian and Latino students, Latinx students, probably stayed around 11 or 12% the past few years. Black students has been 5% or lower basically since the 70s. Right now, I think as of last fall, it was 4.7%. And so, yeah, if there's, now again, this is economic, this is financial investment, right? Because these students are coming in, but how are we going to support them? How are we going to create this level field? So I think those are the ways that the overall structure of the system kind of plays out to a smaller population in terms of Hana students at BC.
Is there reaching out to the RAs, for instance, and that element of student services to work on some of these social issues? I mean, not just channeling the students who need it to Montserrat and the Theohana, I mean, the various other programs. But how does one address the social issues at the, you know, at the dorm level, really? The day-to-day level, because it seems to me like that is the things that you recommended for faculty are definitely a step in the right direction, and certainly reaching out is something which would be easy to start to try to implement better. But the day-to-day seems to be a real issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly ran into questions and issues with some students last year who were on the multicultural floor, which was backfiring on them, essentially, not just because that became the place where some people sort of ran rampant with bigoted actions, but also because it wasn't multicultural. It was a floor where it was the students of color among themselves, and not a community that was helping the rest of the community to figure out how to be neighbors.
Well, I mean, I think there's a few different things. So I just kind of, I think in terms of the multicultural floor, so I think they've gone, you know, kind of back and forth in terms of like the goal of it. I think from the student perspective. So again, if you're a minority on campus, students know that by participating in especially coming into BC, one, you're going to be on upper campus as opposed to Newton. So that's always desirable to students. And then two, in terms of that feeling of feeling out of place 24/7, if you can be in a community with at least people that kind of look like you, then at least you can kind of, all right, let me exhale for a little bit. So I feel as though the multicultural MLE it's starting to be where at least students of color can kind of live together, right? And that's now in terms of the residence hall. So it's not always, so it's not necessarily, I don't think, things that are happening in the residence halls per se, because, you know, the RAs have programs they got to do in certain budgets, but I think it's things like parties that students can and will do on their own, right? And so I think it combines some of the saturation piece. So if 70% of the students can't do this, then maybe it's not happening every weekend, right? If it was more balanced, like 50-50, where maybe someone in the residence hall would be like, whoa, that's way too expensive. Like, how are we gonna, you know, but everyone's like, oh yeah, let's do it. And let's invite everyone because everyone can kind of do it. So I think part of it is the saturation. I think part of it is the communication. As we mentioned, the transparency, like, hey, this is the reality of the situation. So let's try to be neighbors to each other and things like that. And personally speaking, I just feel like a lot of it is just the education overall, right? So like whether it's courage to know sections, English classes, like we're not really, you know, even when we kind of talk about race and diversity and inclusivity, we know that students can come into BC and graduate without really touching any aspect of that if they so choose. So there are many students that aren't involved in any of these. And even though we might require one or two things, you know, 30 minutes hitting a couple buttons may not really have a lasting impact. And so there's no kind of integrated year after year building on kind of society and things like that. And so it's, you know, ignorance is bliss, and it's easy to kind of be like, wow, I had no idea. And you graduate and, you know, at the end of the day, you're 18, 19. So you kind of really only want to do what you want to do. Right. And so how can we get them in spaces where we're talking about these issues and they can be reflective on those experiences? So so those might be a couple of different ways to address it. But yeah, I don't.
I think those are great, Andy. And I think, Ruth, your question is right on, because it is often the world of roommates and the social world where this plays out in the most memorable ways for students. So it revolves around things like going out to dinner. Okay, we're all going to go out to dinner and we're going to go to Newberry Street. And the student says, oh, I can't go. Why? And she doesn't want to say. So she makes something up. And then the roommates say, oh, you don't like us. you're not one of us. You're not part of this. And, you know, it's because she's been before. And when they're splitting the bill and she's like, I had to work 10 extra hours a week to get to pay this bill. And so then it becomes these fissures, but they're not in the classroom. It's not in like a sanctioned, it's between peers. And it's true with shopping. It's true with these things that happen. And so, yeah, I think when you have a campus where, and we are on the list of, there are more students from families of the 1% than there are from the bottom 60, then these things are going to happen, right? These dinners or these shopping or these things. And so, yeah, like I agree with Andy. How do you try to shift a culture that way to a student from the family of the 1%? Splitting the bill of a dinner is the most natural, easy, non-reflective thing you would ever do. It's all about friendship. It's all about being together, having a sense of camaraderie. There's nothing to do with, other issues, because they just have grown up in that kind of family. So I think that's a huge issue, and one that does have to be, thought about quite a bit in order to make a real change that gets down to that level. That's between two 19-year-olds or a group of 7 friends.
Are there strategies through these various offices to try to create some outlets for that? I mean, I can see that there would be problematic if you were to say, okay, well, we have $50 checks available for you to go out to dinner and be part of this. That's a challenge administratively, among other things. But
well, I would point to Montserrat and Bowman Center, Intercultural Center, and that they do have strategies, and that I think that, and they can be very effective. So, for instance, Andy mentioned books. That books was a huge issue, and unfortunately, our financial aid penalizes students sometimes. There is money set aside for books, but when you fall short, or like Andy said, you worked for a while in the summer, but instead of buying the books that you thought you were going to pay that money for, your parents needed the rent money, so you gave it to your parents, and you couldn't buy your books. So now you're going into class with one, maybe 2 hands tied behind your back because you don't have the texts. Well, Montserrat steps in, Bowman Center steps in, does have books available. These are books that are donated by other students, from past years. In fact, the room in Montserrat is quite incredible if you see the amount of books that they have and the amount of students who utilize that and who do get their books through. But Montserrat's not a bookstore. It doesn't cover every class. It doesn't cover every situation. It doesn't have unlimited books for all students. So as much as they do, it's still a stopgap measure for a bigger problem, which is, as a university, I think the question is, do we think it's okay for students not to have books when they're taking their classes? Or is there something that, it would be like saying it's okay if you can't eat, because well, is it really that necessary that you have 3 meals a day? I think that makes a huge difference for your learning. If you have that, and if you don't have books, are you getting the kind of experience in the classroom that you need in order to do that? So there's that. I also think there are cases where we do give students money for groceries, for instance, through cards to purchase food. We give them clothing, as Andy discussed, and as Yvonne has talked to me about many times. We have food available in these offices where students come by and can access food because we have a number of students who are not eating enough, or don't have the meal plans or their own kitchens to do as much. And so we do try to address that. Does that help enough? There's so much need. I mean, that's part of the problem is the amount of need.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the food too. So I guess, Ruth, in answer to your question, it is a larger issue in terms of administration, right? So not just do students need, so I'm in student affairs. Bert and Yvonne are in mission and ministry, you all are in academics, and yet we're all working with the same students. And so I feel as though, you know, we each have our little committees and things, but we really got to work together and kind of follow the student, right? Like what's their experience like the first year? What does orientation look like? What do the residence halls setup look like? You know, where are they living? If we know that students are going to have difficulty paying and making meals, then maybe we don't put them in spaces where they don't have kitchens, unless that's what they want, right? But now it's like, oh, okay, well, here you are, yeah, and now they just got to deal with it. So they might save a little bit of money because they're not paying for the kitchen and the housing, but it's not like that money is in the bank and they can now use that money to go shopping, right? The money was never there. They were going to pay for it down the line. And so I think that's another way, but I do think, you know, places like the Career Closet, I think even Montserrat has, we just started doing a couple books last year, but we mostly have books from our summer program. So if it's like math books and things like that, but I know most students go to Montserrat for that. I know the Career Center has a Career Closet. So and Yvonne, do you all have like a close?
No, we do not. A couple of years back, yes, but now we're working with Successful Start, which is going to happen on the 29th of October, where the students, not only the Montserrat students, but the international students were able to go in for the day and do some shopping. So if you want to volunteer, it's from 10 to 1, and you can go in and you're going to meet some students, you're going to help them shop, and it's a fun time. I will be there from 10 to 12. I'm putting in 2 hours. So if you want, you know, you're always asking, how can I help? This is the way to help. So, you know, there's a little sign-up sheet going around. So definitely
involved. Now that's a woman who spends a lot of time in church because she's used to asking for volunteers. I can
There you go. Can we get an amen? And honestly, it's, you know, I do agree with what Bert said. Great presentation, Bert, and what, you know, Andy followed up with. And again, it all boils down to everyone working together. I like the point that Angie just alluded to. We're all in different areas, but how can we collaborate and work together? Because at the end of the day, it's all about our students, whether they're, you know, and for me, it's whether they have more money than the others. It's at the end of the day, we're working for the students' benefit. The parents are entrusting us to help these students to graduate. And when we talk about food and the formation of students, and Bert alluded to the fact, dinner time, that's a time where students off campus get together because they want to break bread and fit in. And a lot of times it's challenging for the students that myself and Andy serves and the first gen office. But again, for me, it's been a pleasure working and advocating for the students. And then they're allowed to take that class that Bert teaches as we encourage him to come on and present, which he did an extremely wonderful job today. And again, I have to share that for the provost office, Billy Sue, at the beginning of the semester, myself and Deja gets together and we have a conversation about, okay, what are the needs? What are the books that students are lacking? And then we let Billy Sue know, and he sends out a letter to all the faculty, letting them know that you're gonna have some students in your classrooms that are, you know, may not get that book that first week. If you have an extra book, please walk it over to Montserrat. They'll gladly accept. And I have to say, over the couple of years that we've done that, and Billy Sue sent a letter, I get to meet faculty that actually walk into Montserrat and they say, oh, this is where you are. We've got a couple of books. So I know that everyone sees the need and everyone's coming together, and we're trying to work for one common cause, and that's making sure that these students have everything that they need and the skill base that they need to function in these classes that they have to take.
Kim has been trying to ask a question for about 15 minutes.
Oh, I
No, not at all. This was so helpful. Thank you, Andy, Yvonne. Really grateful for your thoughts here. I just wanted to circle back around to that point about, you know, how do we help foster a sense of student belonging by getting them integrated into the larger campus community, the predominant culture on campus, shift that culture so that it is less hostile, right, to students who have belonging uncertainty on campus. And then what does it look like to create spaces of belonging that are, you know, truly safe spaces, and that they are identity safe spaces where students aren't feeling like they're under threat or need to be on the lookout for threats. And one of the things that I just think about a lot is the research by a higher education scholar, Sean Harper, who takes a really strengths-based approach to thinking about minoritized and marginalized students on campus, and who really thinks about how the peer mentoring amongst students with shared identities and who have shared experiences of oppression on college campuses is incredibly helpful for their learning, right? So that peer-to-peer mentoring amongst students is often one of the most significant success strategies that marginalized students have on campus to succeed. And so spaces like an MLE floor, even when it, it might mean that that space compromises to some extent on the transformation of the larger campus community, kind of incredible meaning making and educational benefits for the students who are living there. One of the things that always stands out for me from this article I put in the chat is that he asks a question of a student he's interviewing. I think it's a study of Black men who succeed in predominantly white colleges, white institutions. And he says, who was your most significant teacher on campus? And the person rattles off a name and he goes like, okay, and what class did that person teach you? And it's like, oh no, like she wasn't a teacher of mine. She was the person 2 years ahead of me in the Black Student Council who has made it possible for me to learn in campus, right? And so the strain, this is a question I have a lot. Like, what is an instructor? What is someone who works with instructors can I do to help foster those environments? Is it just me getting out of the way and knowing that that happens? Is there ways for me to encourage that peer-to-peer connections in my courses? But the ingenuity of students who are figuring out ways to thrive in hostile environments, like we have a responsibility to change those environments, but also those students are doing incredible things.
I think you can do something, and it's number one to direct them to the resources that do exist. So I think of the Montserrat Dinner Club. I think of the myriad programs in the Intercultural Center on campus that do that kind of peer-to-peer mentoring that you're talking about. So just being familiar with that, and then as a faculty member, encouraging your students to participate, giving them it takes a little bravery sometimes to kind of step up and do. Andy just put in May's mentoring programs is a terrific example of that, but there are many others. So they do exist, and encouragement from faculty can make a real difference. The second thing I would say is be really careful about assumptions. And this is something that trips up a lot of professors. And it's all rooted in the racist assumptions that we have in this country around who's poor and who's not. Andy referenced it around Black students. There, at one point, Yvonne and I looked at the numbers, and this may be true now, but it was a few years ago when we were talking about it. There were more Black students on campus who were not Montserrat than there are who are Montserrat. So if you assume just because someone's Black that they're poor, you're making, on this campus at that time, you were making an incredibly wrong assumption based on racism. Conversely, Asian students. I had an Asian student, grew up in the United States, was born of immigrant parents from Korea. Both of his parents worked in a Chinese restaurant. They made very, very little money. He was on a full scholarship to Boston College. He always dressed as nice as he could. He had a slight accent, but he spoke English quite well. His professor assumed that he was from China and that he was an international student and he was very, very wealthy. So when the student admitted to his faculty member that he hadn't bought the book, the faculty member ripped into him, called him lazy, called him, sort of made all this assumption. The kid comes to me in tears saying, I'm Korean. I'm from Atlanta. When you make assumptions about how people are based on the wealth, you're generally going to probably guess wrong based on these bigotries that often are circulating in this country. So encouraging them, but also making sure you don't, and that's why it's always good to say, like, I know what Montserrat is. Are you a Montserrat? So that you can kind of just ask them, let them tell you, not assume just by looking at them quickly who they are. So.
And I'll just add, I'm sorry, just real quick. So in addition to the Maze mentoring program, staff and faculty to peers, we also have List As You Climb. So that's a peer-to-peer from OTE students who have done the program and incoming students. I know Mission and Ministry has the Compass program that's peer-to-peer. A lot of student cultural clubs and organizations created their own mentoring program where they kind of call them families. So I think those and to Bert's point, so I don't know, in terms of what people view as success, our students do graduate. So it's not like they're not quote unquote successful by those metrics. I think we're looking at their experience while they're here. And the one thing that I would caution, is I don't want to put any onus on the students to create an environment that we should already have when they come through the door, right? Because I think we see with race relations, students have to explain this in the class, they're the only, and this would just be something else now, if they want to do it out the bottom of their heart, hey, I had a tough time, I want to help you and I want to pull you up, that's awesome. But I would just kind of, shy away from like this college round, like mentoring program or peer-to-peer based on just that.
So I need to jump in because it's 2:01 already. And so we are past our time. But I really want to thank you so much, Bert, for words of wisdom, eye-opening, and for Andy and Yvonne also for jumping in and reinforcing what Bert's talking about. This is being recorded, and so please let people know that they have access to this wisdom, even if they were not able to join us today. What they missed was the chance to ask you questions and to pick up on your points and go deeper. But thank you so much for all the wisdom and all that you've shared with us, and hopefully we'll continue to make Boston College an even better place.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.